The humid Manila air pressed against the tinted windows of the black SUV as it navigated through the congested streets of Makati's business district. Manny Pacquiao sat in the passenger seat, his weathered hands folded in his lap, watching the familiar cityscape blur past. The towering glass buildings reflected the late afternoon sun, casting long shadows across the sidewalks where vendors hawked their wares and office workers hurried toward the MRT stations. His driver, a quiet man named Isagani, who had worked for the family for nearly a decade, expertly maneuvered through the traffic. They were heading to a charity foundation meeting, another in the endless series of commitments that filled Manny's post-boxing life. At 45, the legendary fighter had traded his gloves for a different kind of purpose, channeling his fame and resources into helping those who reminded him of his younger self. As they approached a red light near the Ayala Triangle, Manny's attention was drawn to a small crowd gathered around a street corner. Street performers were common in this area, but something about this particular scene made him lean forward in his seat. Through the gaps between pedestrians, he caught a glimpse of an elderly man sitting on a piece of cardboard, his back against a concrete wall. The man's posture was unmistakable, despite the years that had passed. The way he held his shoulders, slightly hunched but still maintaining a certain dignity, triggered a flood of memories in Manny's mind. His heart began to race as recognition dawned slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Isagani noticed his passenger's sudden tension and followed his gaze. The light turned green, but Manny raised his hand, signaling him to wait. Other drivers began honking their horns, but Manny barely heard them. His entire focus was fixed on the figure across the street. The man on the sidewalk was thin, much thinner than Manny remembered. His clothes were worn and dirty, layers of mismatched garments that spoke of nights spent outdoors. A small cardboard sign rested beside him, though Manny couldn't make out the words from this distance. What struck him most was the man's face, gaunt and weathered, but unmistakably familiar. It was Edgardo Santos, his former manager from the early days of his professional career. The man who had believed in him when he was just another hungry kid from General Santos City, desperate to make something of himself in the brutal world of professional boxing. Edgardo had been there during those crucial first years, helping navigate contracts and training schedules, always wearing his signature white polo shirt and carrying a worn leather briefcase. Manny's mind raced back to their last meeting, nearly 15 years ago. There had been disagreements about money, about the direction of his career, about loyalty and trust. Words had been exchanged that couldn't be taken back, and their professional relationship had ended abruptly. Edgardo had disappeared from the boxing world shortly after, and Manny had been too proud and too busy climbing toward championship glory to reach out. Now, seeing his former mentor reduced to begging on the streets of Makati, Manny felt a crushing weight settle in his chest. The success, the mansions, the political career, the millions of dollars. None of it seemed to matter in this moment. All he could think about was the man who had once sat across from him in dingy gyms, explaining contract terms and encouraging him to keep fighting when the odds seemed impossible. The honking behind them grew more insistent, but Manny remained frozen, staring at the broken figure of someone who had once been so important to his journey. Guilt, regret, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility washed over him in waves. This was more than a chance encounter. It felt like a reckoning with his past, a moment that would define what kind of man he had truly become. Manny's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the door handle, but Isagani gently placed a hand on his shoulder, reminding him of the security protocols they always followed. The driver quickly found a parking spot 2 blocks away, and together they walked back toward the corner where Edgardo sat. With each step, more memories flooded back, painting vivid pictures of a time when everything seemed simpler, yet infinitely more uncertain. He remembered their first meeting at the old Ilorde boxing gym in Paranaque. Manny had been 17, weighing barely 106 pounds, with calloused hands and dreams bigger than his malnourished frame. Edgardo had been watching from the corner, taking notes in a small notebook, his keen eyes evaluating every movement, every combination thrown during sparring sessions. Back then, Edgardo had been a respected figure in Philippine boxing circles. He wore pressed shirts and polished shoes, carried himself with the confidence of someone who understood both the business and the art of the sport. His briefcase contained contracts from small promoters, medical clearances, and carefully calculated training schedules. More importantly, it held hope for fighters like Manny, who had nothing but raw talent and desperate hunger. The early days of their partnership had been marked by long bus rides to provincial fights, sleeping in cheap hotels with paper-thin walls, and splitting meager purses that barely covered training expenses. Edgardo had fronted money for proper equipment, arranged for better sparring partners, and negotiated with local promoters who often tried to shortchange young fighters. He had been more than a manager. He had been a mentor, a father figure, and sometimes the only person who believed Manny could rise above his circumstances. As they approached the corner, Manny could see Edgardo more clearly. The man's hair had turned completely grey, and deep lines etched his face like a roadmap of hardship. His clothes were layered for warmth despite the tropical heat, and a small plastic cup sat beside him with a few coins scattered at the bottom. Pedestrians walked past without making eye contact, their hurried steps creating a rhythm of indifference that seemed to echo through the concrete canyon of the business district. Manny stopped about 20 feet away, partially hidden behind a newspaper vendor's stall. From this distance he could read the cardboard sign that leaned against Edgardo's knee. The words were written in careful block letters. "Former boxing manager. Please help. God bless." The simplicity of the message hit Manny like a physical blow, stripping away years of accumulated pride and success. He thought about the last conversation they had shared in a hotel room in Cebu after a particularly difficult negotiation with an American promoter. Edgardo had expressed concerns about the direction Manny's career was taking, worried that bigger management companies would push aside the people who had been there from the beginning. Manny, flush with his first taste of international recognition, had dismissed these concerns as paranoia and jealousy. The argument that followed had been heated and personal. Accusations flew about loyalty, money, and the changing dynamics of professional boxing. Edgardo had accused Manny of forgetting where he came from, while Manny had questioned his manager's ability to handle the bigger opportunities that were emerging. The partnership had dissolved that night, with both men too proud to bridge the growing gap between them. Now, watching his former mentor reduced to begging on the streets, Manny realized how hollow his victories had become. Every championship belt, every sold-out arena, every political office he had held seemed meaningless compared to the sight of this broken man who had once believed in him unconditionally. The weight of his neglect pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy training bag, making it difficult to breathe in the humid afternoon air. Manny's feet felt heavy as he took the first tentative steps toward Edgardo. The 20-foot distance seemed to stretch endlessly, each step carrying the weight of 15 years of silence and regret. Isagani followed at a respectful distance, his trained eyes scanning the surrounding area while remaining alert to his employer's emotional state. The afternoon crowd continued to flow around them, like water around stones in a river. Office workers clutched their phones and briefcases. Street vendors called out their wares, and the constant hum of traffic created an urban symphony that had become the soundtrack of modern Manila. Yet for Manny, the world seemed to narrow to just this corner, this moment, and the man who sat unaware of his approach. As he drew closer, more details became painfully clear. Edgardo's hands, once steady and confident as they signed contracts and counted purse money, now showed the tremor of age and hardship. His fingernails were dirty, and his skin had the weathered appearance of someone who had spent too many nights exposed to the elements. A small plastic bag beside him contained what appeared to be his only possessions: a few pieces of clothing, a worn rosary, and a faded photograph that Manny couldn't quite make out. The smell of the streets, exhaust fumes mixed with cooking food from nearby vendors, and the underlying scent of urban decay filled Manny's nostrils. It was a smell he remembered from his childhood in General Santos, when his family had lived in similar circumstances. The familiarity of it brought back memories of hunger, of uncertainty, of nights when sleep came fitfully on makeshift beds in overcrowded rooms. Edgardo's eyes were closed, his head tilted back against the concrete wall. His breathing was shallow but steady, and Manny wondered if he was sleeping or simply resting his eyes against the harsh glare of the afternoon sun. The cardboard beneath him was stained and worn, suggesting this had been his spot for some time. The thought that his former manager had been living like this, possibly for months or even years, while Manny enjoyed the comfort of his multiple homes, felt like a knife twisting in his chest. A group of teenagers walked past, one of them dropping a few coins into Edgardo's cup without breaking stride. The sound of the coins hitting the plastic seemed to rouse the old man slightly, and he opened his eyes just enough to nod in gratitude toward the retreating figures. It was then that Manny saw the full extent of what time and circumstances had done to someone who had once been so vital to his success. Edgardo's eyes, once sharp and calculating as they evaluated opponents and negotiated deals, now held a distant quality that spoke of resignation and acceptance. They were the eyes of someone who had learned to expect little from life and to be grateful for small mercies. The transformation was so complete that Manny wondered if he would have recognized his former manager at all, if not for those distinctive mannerisms that remained unchanged. The weight of his own success suddenly felt crushing. Every luxury he enjoyed, every comfort his family took for granted, seemed to mock the suffering of the man who had helped make it all possible. Manny thought about his mansion in Forbes Park, his collection of luxury cars, his children's private school educations, and his wife Jinky's designer clothes. All of it had been built on a foundation that included Edgardo's early guidance and sacrifice. Standing just 10 feet away now, Manny felt paralyzed by the magnitude of what this encounter represented. This wasn't just about helping a homeless person. This was about confronting his own past, acknowledging his failures as a human being, and finding a way to bridge a gap that had seemed unbridgeable for so many years. Manny took another step forward, and the slight movement caught Edgardo's peripheral vision. The old man's head turned slowly, his weathered face lifting to look at the figure approaching him. For a moment, there was no recognition, just the cautious wariness of someone who had learned to be suspicious of strangers, even those who might offer help. But then something shifted in Edgardo's expression. His eyes, clouded with fatigue and resignation, began to focus more intently on Manny's face. The process of recognition was gradual, like watching dawn break over the mountains of Mindanao. First came confusion, then disbelief, and finally a mixture of shock and something that might have been shame. Edgardo's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His hands, which had been resting limply on his knees, began to tremble more noticeably. He tried to push himself up straighter against the wall, an instinctive attempt to maintain some dignity in the face of this impossible encounter. The effort was painful to watch, as his weakened body struggled to comply with his mind's desperate desire to appear less broken. Manny could see the internal struggle playing out across his former manager's features. There was recognition, certainly, but also deep embarrassment and what appeared to be genuine fear. Perhaps Edgardo was wondering if this was real, or just another cruel dream brought on by hunger and exhaustion. Perhaps he was calculating how to explain his current circumstances to someone who had once depended on his guidance and protection. The plastic cup beside Edgardo contained perhaps 20 pesos in small coins, barely enough for a single meal. The sight of it made Manny's stomach clench with a familiar sensation he hadn't felt in years. It was the same hollow feeling he had experienced as a child, when his mother, Dionysia, would count and recount their meager savings, trying to stretch every peso to feed her children. Around them, the city continued its relentless pace. A businessman in an expensive suit walked past, talking loudly into his phone about stock prices and quarterly reports. A group of college students laughed as they shared stories about their weekend plans. Street vendors called out prices for fresh fruit and bottled water. The contrast between this normal urban life and the profound moment unfolding on the sidewalk felt surreal. Edgardo's eyes never left Manny's face, as if he was afraid that looking away might cause this apparition to disappear. There was something heartbreaking about the hope that was beginning to creep into his expression, mixed with the terror of potential disappointment. His lips moved silently, perhaps forming Manny's name, but no sound emerged. Manny noticed details that spoke of long-term homelessness. Edgardo's shoes were held together with tape and string, and his clothes bore the stains and wear patterns of someone who had no access to regular washing facilities. His hair, once neatly combed and styled, was now long and unkempt, with patches of grey that made him look older than his 68 years. But despite the physical deterioration, there was something in Edgardo's eyes that remained unchanged, a spark of intelligence and dignity that no amount of hardship had been able to extinguish. It was the same quality that had made him such an effective manager in the early days, the ability to see potential where others saw only problems, to find solutions where others saw only obstacles. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history and the weight of choices made and unmade. Manny felt as if he was standing at a crossroads, not just of this encounter, but of his entire life. Everything he had become, everything he claimed to believe about loyalty and gratitude and remembering where you came from was being tested in this single moment on a busy Makati street corner. Without hesitation, Manny dropped to his knees on the concrete sidewalk beside Edgardo. The action was so sudden and unexpected that several passers-by stopped to stare, their phones already emerging from pockets as they recognized the famous boxer. But Manny was oblivious to the growing attention, his entire focus centered on the broken man before him. The concrete was rough against his expensive slacks, and he could feel the heat radiating up from the pavement that had been baking in the Manila sun all day. None of that mattered. What mattered was closing the physical and emotional distance that had separated them for so many years. By lowering himself to Edgardo's level, Manny was making a statement that went beyond words, an acknowledgement of equality, of shared humanity, of respect that transcended their current circumstances. Edgardo's eyes widened at this unexpected gesture. In Filipino culture, such an action carried profound meaning. For someone of Manny's stature to kneel beside a homeless person was not just unusual, it was revolutionary. It spoke of humility, of genuine care, of a willingness to set aside social barriers in favor of human connection. Manny reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, but then paused. Simply giving money felt inadequate, almost insulting given their shared history. This wasn't about charity, this was about acknowledgement, about making amends, about recognizing the role Edgardo had played in his journey to greatness. The wallet went back into his pocket as Manny searched for a more meaningful way to bridge the gap between them. Instead, he reached out slowly and placed his hand on Edgardo's shoulder. The old man's body was thin beneath the layers of worn clothing, and Manny could feel him trembling. Whether from emotion, malnutrition, or the shock of this encounter, he couldn't tell. The touch seemed to break something inside Edgardo, and tears began to flow down his weathered cheeks. The crowd around them was growing larger, with people pulling out phones to record this unprecedented scene. Whispers rippled through the gathering crowd as word spread that the legendary Manny Pacquiao was kneeling on a Makati sidewalk with a homeless man. But Manny remained focused solely on Edgardo, creating an intimate bubble of connection amid the urban chaos. Manny's own eyes began to fill with tears as he looked into the face of the man who had believed in him when no one else would. He remembered Edgardo's patient explanations of contract terms when Manny could barely read, his encouragement after devastating losses, his careful management of the small purses that had kept Manny's family fed during the lean years. This man had been more than a manager. He had been a guardian angel, disguised as a businessman. The weight of 15 years of silence pressed down on both men. Manny thought about all the times he could have reached out, all the opportunities he had missed to check on someone who had been so instrumental in his success. Pride, busy schedules, and the intoxicating rush of fame had created barriers that now seemed foolish and cruel. Edgardo's free hand moved slowly toward Manny's face, as if he needed to touch him to confirm this wasn't a dream. His fingers, gnarled and dirty from life on the streets, trembled as they made contact with Manny's cheek. The gesture was tender and heartbreaking, carrying all the affection and pride of a father seeing his son after a long separation. Around them, the city continued its relentless pace, but for these two men, time seemed suspended. The noise of traffic faded into background static, the curious crowd became invisible, and the harsh realities of their current circumstances dissolved into something more fundamental, the recognition of shared humanity and the power of genuine connection to heal even the deepest wounds. Manny gently helped Edgardo to his feet supporting his frail frame as they both stood on the busy sidewalk. The old man's legs were unsteady, weakened by months of poor nutrition and sleeping on hard surfaces. As he rose, Manny noticed how much smaller Edgardo had become, not just thinner, but somehow diminished in a way that spoke of dreams deferred and hope gradually eroded by circumstance. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 30 people, their phones capturing every moment of this unexpected reunion. Manny could hear the excited whispers and see the flashes of camera lights, but his attention remained fixed on Edgardo's immediate needs. The old man swayed slightly, and Manny steadied him with a firm but gentle grip on his arm. Isagani approached cautiously, understanding without words that his employer needed assistance. Manny gestured toward Edgardo's meager possessions, the cardboard sign, the plastic bag of belongings, the small cup with its handful of coins. With careful respect, Isagani gathered these items, treating them with the same dignity he would show to valuable luggage. To Edgardo, these few possessions represented everything he owned in the world. The walk to the SUV was slow and deliberate. Edgardo's steps were uncertain, and Manny found himself remembering how this same man had once stridden confidently through boxing gyms and hotel lobbies, commanding respect from promoters and fighters alike. The transformation was a stark reminder of how quickly circumstances could change, how thin the line was between success and desperation. As they reached the vehicle, Manny made a decision that would change both their lives. Instead of simply offering temporary help or a one-time payment, he realized that Edgardo needed something more comprehensive: medical attention, proper nutrition, safe housing, and most importantly, the restoration of his dignity. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with money alone. It required time, commitment, and genuine care. Manny opened the rear door of the SUV and helped Edgardo settle into the leather seat. The contrast was jarring, the homeless man's worn clothing against the pristine interior of the luxury vehicle. But Edgardo's eyes showed no embarrassment, only gratitude and a growing sense of disbelief that this was actually happening. The air conditioning provided immediate relief from the oppressive Manila heat, and Manny noticed Edgardo's breathing become more relaxed. He reached into the small refrigerator built into the vehicle's console and retrieved a bottle of water, opening it carefully before offering it to his former manager. Edgardo's hand shook as he accepted it, and he drank slowly, savoring each sip as if it were the finest wine. As Isagani navigated through the traffic toward their destination, Manny's mind raced with plans and possibilities. His first priority was getting Edgardo proper medical attention. The old man clearly needed evaluation for malnutrition, possible infections, and other health issues that came with prolonged homelessness. Then would come the challenge of finding appropriate long-term housing and support. But beyond the practical considerations, Manny was grappling with deeper questions about responsibility and redemption. How many other people from his past had fallen through the cracks while he enjoyed the fruits of success they had helped him achieve? How many former trainers, sparring partners, or support staff were struggling in obscurity while he lived in luxury? The weight of these realizations settled heavily on his shoulders, but rather than feeling overwhelmed, Manny felt energized by a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. This encounter with Edgardo wasn't just about helping one person, it was about reconnecting with the values that had driven him as a young fighter, about remembering that true success was measured not just by personal achievement, but by the positive impact you had on others. The SUV pulled into the circular driveway of St. Luke's Medical Center in Bonifacio Global City, one of the Philippines' most prestigious hospitals. Manny had called ahead during the drive, using his influence to ensure that Edgardo would receive immediate and comprehensive medical attention. The hospital staff was already waiting at the entrance, a team of nurses and doctors prepared to handle what they understood to be a special case requiring discretion and exceptional care. As they helped Edgardo from the vehicle, Manny was struck by how small and vulnerable his former manager appeared against the backdrop of the modern medical facility. The gleaming glass and steel structure represented the pinnacle of healthcare technology, a stark contrast to the street corner where they had found Edgardo just hours earlier. Yet there was something dignified in the way the old man carried himself, even in his weakened state, that reminded Manny of the proud professional he had once known. The medical team worked with quiet efficiency, transferring Edgardo to a wheelchair and beginning their initial assessment even as they moved toward the emergency department. Manny walked alongside, his hand resting gently on Edgardo's shoulder, providing both physical and emotional support. The hospital corridors, with their antiseptic smell and fluorescent lighting, felt like a bridge between two worlds, the harsh reality of street life and the possibility of renewal and recovery. Dr. Amelia Reyes, the attending physician, conducted a thorough examination while Manny waited in a private consultation room. The initial findings were concerning but not hopeless: severe malnutrition, dehydration, a respiratory infection, and various skin conditions consistent with prolonged exposure to the elements. More troubling were the signs of depression and the psychological toll of extended homelessness, conditions that would require careful and patient treatment. While Edgardo underwent further tests and received IV fluids and medications, Manny made a series of phone calls that would reshape both their futures. He contacted his personal assistant, instructing her to prepare one of the guest houses on his Forbes Park property for long-term occupancy. He called his family doctor to arrange for ongoing medical care and spoke with a nutritionist about developing a recovery plan for someone in Edgardo's condition. Most importantly, Manny reached out to his wife Jinky, explaining the situation and asking for her support in what would be a long-term commitment to Edgardo's recovery. Her immediate and wholehearted agreement reminded him why he had fallen in love with her. Beneath the glamorous exterior was a woman with a generous heart who understood the importance of loyalty and gratitude. As evening approached, Edgardo had been admitted to a private room where he would spend the next several days under medical supervision. The transformation was already beginning. Clean hospital gowns replaced his tattered street clothes, proper nutrition was being administered intravenously, and the haunted look in his eyes was slowly giving way to something that resembled hope. Manny sat beside the hospital bed, watching his former manager sleep peacefully for perhaps the first time in months. The steady beeping of monitoring equipment provided a reassuring rhythm, and the soft lighting created an atmosphere of healing and safety. Outside the window, the lights of Manila twinkled like stars, a reminder of the vibrant city that had both created and nearly destroyed the man lying in the bed. The magnitude of what lay ahead was daunting. Edgardo's recovery would be measured not in days or weeks, but in months and possibly years. There would be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt. But as Manny looked at the peaceful expression on his former manager's face, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for too long. This wasn't just about repaying a debt or assuaging guilt. It was about reclaiming the values that had made him who he was, about honoring the people who had believed in him when belief was all they had to offer. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through the windows of the renovated guest house on Manny's Forbes Park estate, casting warm light across the comfortable living room where Edgardo sat reading the sports section of the Philippine Daily Inquirer. His transformation was remarkable. Proper nutrition had restored color to his cheeks, regular medical care had addressed his health issues, and most importantly, having purpose and dignity restored, had brought back the spark in his eyes that had been dimmed by years of hardship. The guest house had been completely refurbished to accommodate Edgardo's needs, with grab bars in the bathroom, a well-stocked kitchen, and a small office where he had begun working on a project that had become his passion, documenting the stories of Filipino boxers who had struggled in obscurity. Manny had provided him with a laptop, and Edgardo spent hours each day writing, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the same precision he had once used to negotiate contracts. The relationship between the two men had evolved into something deeper than their original manager-fighter dynamic. They had become genuine friends, bound together by shared history and mutual respect. Every morning, Edgardo would join Manny for coffee on the main house's terrace, where they would discuss everything from boxing to politics to family. These conversations had become the highlight of both their days, a time when the successful politician and businessman could reconnect with his roots through the wisdom of someone who had known him before fame changed everything. Jinky had embraced Edgardo like a member of the family, often bringing him home-cooked meals and including him in family gatherings. The Pacquiao children, Jimuel, Michael, Princess, Queen Elizabeth, and Israel, had grown fond of their honorary grandfather, who regaled them with stories of their father's early fighting days and taught them valuable lessons about perseverance and humility. But perhaps the most significant change was in Manny himself. The encounter with Edgardo had awakened something that had been dormant for years, a renewed sense of social responsibility that went beyond charitable donations and public appearances. He had established the Second Chances Foundation, dedicated to helping former athletes and sports industry professionals who had fallen on hard times. Edgardo served as the foundation's director, using his experience and connections to identify and assist those who needed help. The foundation had already helped dozens of people, former boxers struggling with brain injuries, retired trainers living in poverty, and sports journalists who had been forgotten by an industry that had moved on without them. Each success story reinforced Manny's belief that true greatness was measured not by championships won or money earned, but by the positive impact you had on the lives of others. On this particular morning, as Edgardo prepared for another day of work at the foundation, he paused to look at a framed photograph on his desk. It showed him and Manny from the early days, both young and hungry, standing outside a small gym in Paranaque. The contrast between that image and their current circumstances was striking, but what remained constant was the bond between them, a connection forged in struggle and strengthened by loyalty. The story of their reunion had become legendary in Philippine boxing circles, inspiring other successful fighters to reach out to people from their past who might need assistance. It had sparked a movement of remembrance and gratitude that extended far beyond the world of sports, reminding an entire generation that success without compassion was ultimately hollow. As Manny prepared to leave for another day of political duties, he stopped by the guest house to check on Edgardo. The sight of his former manager, healthy and purposeful, working diligently at his desk, filled him with a satisfaction that surpassed any championship victory. This was his greatest triumph, not the defeat of any opponent in the ring, but the victory over his own pride and the successful rescue of someone who had helped make his dreams possible. The circle had been completed, but it was not an ending. It was a new beginning. The foundation would continue to grow. More lives would be touched and transformed, and the lesson learned on that Makati street corner would ripple outward, creating waves of positive change that would extend far beyond anything either man could have imagined when they first shook hands in that small gym so many years ago.